So welcome to Boundless and Bottomless Seas as we continue our long march through Aleksandr Dugin's Fourth Political Theory. We get to the chapter on civilization, imperialism, and colonialism, and I realized that, and I also owe this to an article by Mary Davidson, that the decolonization rhetoric in Dugin is not anti-imperial. Explicitly. In fact, they're pro-empire, although there's limits to it, and we'll get into that today.
Yeah.
But they consider colonization bad, but empire is actually fine, which is going to really confuse people. But it actually it led me to realize that, like, oh no, the Duginists know that multipolarity is an imperial project.
Well, yeah, I mean that's part of why his whole kind of basis is the civilizational state and integration in a way which is ever closer union until everything that's even marginally like that civilization is all the imperial. Yeah.
So we're gonna have to get into this. And I think this is we're probably not gonna make as much quick hay at this chapter because A, it's longer, but B, also there's a lot of key concepts that finally get clarified.
Finally.
Right.
Yeah.
But also this is where like the superficial rhyming with post-structural leftism really starts to fall apart. Like,
we're gonna start to see some distinctions.
Right. The bait and switch becomes clear that it's a bait and switch. So we'll get into this. We'll just start off with the very first statement in the Millerman Sleboda translation, as opposed to just the Sleboda translation. There is no agreement today as to the meaning of the concept of civilization in intellectual or scientific circles, as, by the way, is the case with other fundamental terms. This sprang from a fundamental meaning of our epoch, shifting from modernity to postmodernity, which is essentially an effective semantic field in linguistic forms. And in so much as we find ourselves in a stage of unsatisfied transition, and an inconceivable confusion reigns in our ideas. Someone uses customary terms in their old sense. Someone feels the necessity for semantic displacement and glances into the future, which is not yet to come. Some fantasies, perhaps closer to the future, are simply falling into individual irrelevant hallucinations. That's funny coming from this guy. Someone else gets completely confused. Now, what I found interesting is if I stopped right there, I agree with that statement that we're in a time period where the fundamental terms are really confused because people are both reaching for a new ontology of the way of speaking about these things and grasping back to old ones. And I point this out all the time. Like, people say, oh, the problems are capitalism. And even fucking liberals say that now. But when I ask, okay, but what's the mechanism that capitalism's the problem? No consensus. Imperialism, that's another one. Of course, I'm an anti-imperialist. I'm not one of these anti-imperialist Marxists. But when I ask people what's the primary mechanism of imperialism, no agreement.
Right.
Not when you really push on it. Like, so that's a valid point he's making. But it's interesting that he focuses on civilization. And I think the civilization stuff, I've talked about this as like radical Sam Huntington thought, but just picking the other side. But there's a little bit more going on here. And this is where it becomes clear that empire and decolonization don't mean the same things for these people as they do for leftists. But they're totally willing to let that semantic confusion stand so that you don't realize you disagree with them. Right. Which makes this text more pernicious than it initially seems. If you're not reading it closely and paying attention to what he's saying, you could think that that Dugin's just an anti-imperialist. He's not.
I don't quite know how I feel about that. I think bait and switch is decent enough, but I think it's more like just Dugin doesn't think it's important to show his work because he just doesn't care, and he has a mishmash of ideas. But when certain of those ideas we don't want to absorb, we look out for them in a different way. But I don't think that Dugin's like I don't exactly know how to say this.
I think the stuff on empire is actively misleading. I don't think that's an accident. Like, because the appeal to anti-imperial politics on the left is made explicit. He says it in another chapter, but then when you realize here, he thinks empire is a necessary step in civilization.
Yeah.
So,
All right.
Anyway, the term civilization received wide circulation in an epoch of rapid development of the theory of progress. The theory proceeded from two fundamental paradigmatic axioms of modernity: the progressive and unidirectional character of human development from minus to plus,
Bad.
and the universality of man as a phenomenon. In this context, civilization for H.L. Morgan defines the stage in which humanity in the 19th century, everyone uncritically believed, as one in evident existence of such a concept as humanity, which tells you that he doesn't.
Yeah.
Versus from the stage of barbarity, which in turn it replaces itself in the stage of savagery. Marx has adopted such an interpretation of civilization easily, having written it into the theory of the evolution of economic systems. According to Morgan, Taylor, and Ingalls, savagery characterizes tribes engaged in gathering and primitive kinds of hunting. Barbarity relates to non-literate societies occupied with simplistic kinds of rural economy and cattle breeding, without a clear division of labor or development of social political institution. Civilization signifies itself at the stage with the appearance of letters, social political institution, cities, crafts, technological improvements, the division of society into classes, the appearance of developed theological and religious systems. Civilization was a thought of as historically steady and able to be preserved, developing but with their primary features remaining constant over the course of millennia. Civilization empire. However, together with the purely historical phase meaning in the concept of civilization, a territorial sense was also included, though less explicitly. Civilization offered a vast enough area of diffusion that is, in addition to a considerable temporal dimension, a broad spatial dimension, also presumed to characterize it. In the territorial sense, the borders of the term civilization in part coincided with the meaning of the word empire. And in the sense of world power. Empire, in the civilizational sense, pointed not to the particularity of a political and administrative arrangement, but to the fact of an active and intense spread of influence, proceeding from the centers of civilization to the surrounding territory, supposedly populated by barbarians or savages. In other words, the concept of civilization can already espy the character of expansion and the export influence of characteristics of empires, both ancient and modern.
So influences, huh? Dissemination of influences. So I guess that's linguistic, cultural, not so much administrative, although I guess that's part of it too. Civilization is more expansive than empire, right?
I think part of the problem is that Dugin is imagining things in a different concept. He's imagining things as though we could just think of them as the way they once were, or the way that we romanticize them to be. I think he's maybe opposed to the current contemporary order, but he's not at all opposed to this older conception of civilization, like Celtic civilizations, different than nations or whatever.
Yeah, it's broader than nation. It's closer to like Christendom than it is to Europe.
Right. Yeah.
It's like a very, very old conception of. It's basically a non-Marxist universalism. It's like, well, if not for class, what's an older way or a different way to divide ourselves, or to understand divide ourselves, but to understand ourselves?
Yeah. The different civilization. Obviously, the Ruski Mir being the essential one for him.
Right.
Which is a series of nations within a civilization, and I'm doing air quotes there.
But you got to think about the Ruski Mir would be actually, in some ways, more interesting as a non-national type, because he also doesn't want to lapse into saying, well, we're the mirror image of the Atlanticist empire, which is also non-national. And by those of you who don't know what I mean, non-national means one similar language and ethnic group, right? So
what's interesting here is
think about the Ruski Mir.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, what's interesting here is that by virtue of Dugin's total rejection of the USSR and all of the hopes in every direction, he has nowhere else to go except for way further back in time.
Mm.
Yeah.
Right, although it's problematic because what he wants to include into the Eurasian civilization isn't part of the pre-19th century Ruski Mir.
Well, yeah, that's why I think that he's more than just not just looking backwards. He has I think very flawed and very incorrect, but a pretty interesting dialectical way of thinking, which is it's it makes you really have to think a lot.
Yeah. Civilization worked out a new universal type, quantitatively different from the modes of barbarian and savage societies. This type was often built on globalization, that is, of ethno-tribal and/or religious center that stood as a source of the given civilization. But in the course of this globalization, that is, through the equating of the concrete ethnic, social, political, and religious pattern to a universal standard, the very important process of transcending the ethnos itself occurred, transferring its natural and organic, most often unconsciously imparted tradition into the rank of man-made and conscious rational systems.
So this is an interesting move he's making now, equating the process of like expansion and civilization creation with globalization, right? I think this goes back to his argument that like the rules-based international order, as we call it now, is really Anglo-American Atlanticist civilization attempting to impose itself on other discrete civilizations with different value systems and different historical trajectories and different interests ultimately.
Yeah.
The citizens of Rome, even though in the first stage of empire already differed essentially from the typical residents of Latium, with a wide variety of Muslims praying in Arabic, went far beyond the Bedouin tribes of Arabia and their ethnic descendants. In this way, at the time of the move to civilization, social anthropology quantitatively changed. Man, turning to civilization, had a collective identity imprinted on a fixed body of spiritual culture, which he was obliged to assimilate to a certain degree. Civilization assumed a rational and volitional force from the side of man, which is in the 17th century, after Descartes, philosophers started calling the subject. But the necessity of such a force and the presence of a model, abstracted and fixed in culture, equalized itself to a certain extent with both representatives of the core ethnos of religion lying at the foundation of civilization, and those who ended up in the zone of influence from another ethnic context. To adopt the foundation of civilization was qualitatively easier than to be accepted into a tribe, in so much as there was no demand to organically absorb gigantic reservoirs of unconscious archetypes, but able to perform a rational logical operation. Which, really, by the way, just sounds...
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No. This sounds like Weber mixed with Fukuyama, actually.
I was just thinking about how interesting it is that I'm reading side by side. I'm reading this with Bauer, and he's describing a very similar process in a very different, very different terms.
Right.
Bruno Bauer.
Yeah.
Otto Bauer.
No, Otto Bauer. Yeah.
Otto Bauer. Okay.
Otto Bauer. Yeah, Bruno Bauer, the anti-Jewish / Christian apologist. Otto Bauer is the Austro-Marxist. Doesn't help that so many of these people play roles into development of Marxism.
Yeah.
Civilization and culture. In some contexts, depending on the country or author in the 19th century, the concept was identified with the concept of culture. I find this interesting because while he's critiquing like Anglo-centric worldview, this is a totally Eurocentric development that he's describing here.
Yeah.
Like the rationalization of he's avoiding talking about the rationalization of confessional states and talking about it in a more nebulous manner. And he's talking about globalization because it has a ring of the economic, but when you actually look at what he's talking about here, there's no economic content to it at all.
As per usual, right?
Right.
So, so does that match with my sense that he's using globalization in an ironic way? He's trying to like peak us and say that like the similar process of globalization we've seen over the last couple of decades is really like part and parcel of a broader, more like civilizational movement, which doesn't have necessarily an economic character. Instead, it's got like a cultural character or a...
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's actually inverting those categories on their head without making it apparent that he's doing that. Like,
Right. An
globalization is
interesting
a
move.
civilization impulse, not an economic one.
Right.
So, yeah, which again makes him sound just like Samuel Huntington.
Right.
Like,
Over and over again. Yeah.
in other cases, hierarchical relations were established between them being civilizations. More often, culture was thought of as a spiritual filling of the civilization, while civilization properly meant the formal structure of society, answering to the main point of definition. Oswald Spengler, in his famous book Decline of the Rest, even contrasted civilization and culture, considering the second an expression of an organic, vital spirit of man, but the first a product of the cooling off of that spirit and mechanical and purely technical boundaries. According to Spengler, civilization is a product of cultural death. However, such sharp-witted observation, correctly interpreted some of the contemporary Western civilization, did not receive general acknowledgement. And most today, the term civilization and culture are used as synonyms, although each researcher can have his own opinion on this point.
That's very gracious of you, Aleksandr. He's being snarky there, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting that he's trying to separate cultural and civilizational terms because it becomes very unclear what civilization means in the Spengelian sense. If it's not cultural and it's not economic, it's just a formalization of the priorly cultural. What exactly is it?
It's weird. It's this weird kind of attempt to kind of define all the fuzzy space that in the liminal space in between cultures. It's like, well, that's that you can draw a line with that and say that's what a civilization is, and internal to that is cultures. I don't think he does a good job though, because I think he wants to not say that there's something in this process of becoming, because it sounds Hegelian, because it is, I just don't think that Dugin wants to do that.
All right, so we get into the real interesting stuff where stuff is going to get real contested. Even the most cursory survey of the meaning of the term civilization shows that, in using it, we are dealing with a concept separated with the spirit of the Enlightenment, progressivism, and historicism. Those are not usually the same thing, which are characterized for an epoch of modernity in its uncritical stage. That is, until the fundamental reconsideration of the 20th century. Faith in the progressive development of history and the universality of the human path according to the common logic of development from savagery to civilization, from distinguishing features of the 19th century, but already with Nietzsche and Freud, the so-called philosophers of suspicion, the optimistic axiom started to be doubted. And over a period of the 20th century, Heidegger, the existentialist, traditionalist, structuralist, and late postmodernist smashed it to bits. Notice that he basically throws everybody in the kitchen sink into that sentence.
Yeah. Except Marxists.
Right. Yeah, no, Marxists are dirty modernist.
Right, okay, yeah.
Right.
In postmodernity, criticism of historical optimism, universalism, and historicism acquired a systemic character and established a doctrinal premise for the total revision of the conceptual apparatus of Western European philosophy. The revision itself had not yet been carried out to its conclusion, but what has been done, and we get this shit. This is something that's not unique to Dugin, but like barraging you with a series of names that don't actually necessarily agree with each other, but presented as if they're in total harmony, is a thing that he does. It's a thing that lazy academics do on the left too.
Yeah,
and so it's not. We can't by anything like fault him for this. I see this shit all the time in like Wendy Brown. But anyway,
it's still super fucking annoying though, because it seems like a sentence. A single sentence could at least mark out that there is a difference or there's not a difference between these 2 or 3 names.
Right. Levi-Strauss, Barth, Ricoeur, Foucault, Deleuze, Derrida, and others. I don't even know who the others are. By the way, Derrida's claim to fame and his distinction as a deconstructionist comes with him critiquing Levi-Strauss. So it's already, I'm like, okay, those are different, radically different things. Is already enough to convince one of the impossibility of using the dictionary of modernity without a thorough and rigorous deconstruction. Paul Ricoeur summarized the thesis of the philosophers of suspicion, paints the following picture. Man and man society consists in rational conscious components, charigma, according to Boltzmann, superstructure, according to Marx, ego to Freud. Those aren't the same thing. And the unconscious, properly, structures and the structuralist understanding basis, will the power of Nietzsche, the unconscious, those are not the same thing either.
Yeah.
Are all externally, it seems, to the path of man leads directly from the captivity of the unconsciousness to the kingdom of reason. And that this exactly represents progress and the content of history. In fact, under the closest scrutiny, becomes clear that the unconscious myth, that's not what the unconscious is, that's just Jung, proves much stronger and, as before, considerably predetermines the work of the intellect. Moreover, reason and the unconscious logical activity is almost always nothing other than the gigantic work of repressing unconscious impulse. In other words, an expression of complexes, strategies of displacement, substitution, projection, and so on. In Marx, the unconsciousness is played by the forces of production in the industrial relations. Bullshit.
That just doesn't make any sense.
I interpret that sentence to basically be that they play similar roles. They're not the same. They're not similar in form, but they're similar in their consequence. But again, that's a very charitable reading.
Yeah, that's the most charitable reading, and even I wouldn't believe that the forces of production will act like the individual unconscious at all.
Yeah, no, the mechanisms are completely different.
At best, there's a way to interpret this sentence, which is charitable, which I still disagree with fundamentally.
Right. Yeah. But even taking the most charitable reading, I would still see bullshit.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
There's so much X equals Y in that prior statement that it's hard to know, like,
this whole paragraph is a mess. Like, he, in the parentheses up above with the Baltmanu, Kiergamma, Marx superstructure, Freud ego, the second paragraph where he's naming three other things, they don't coincide to the ones above it. It's a very, very strange structure, this paragraph.
It is.
It's not even the paragraph. It's the thinking at work here is very muddled, or at least is trying to throw enough shit at the wall that we all get.
I think
it is dangerously close to guess galloping. Go ahead.
Yeah,
I think of it similar to the way he thinks of the concept of civilization as like a bigger thing which collects other things. That way you can pair off, make a distinction between nation states and whatever. But I think like many of the things that he thinks, this is just not a clear enough way to express the thought that I don't even really quite know if what I'm saying is true.
What's the relationship between this Gish Gallop right here of like a suspicion of modernity and philosophy of suspicion? What's the connection between this and the civilization versus culture thing that he's been going on this chapter? Is he talking about like the progress of modernity, like leading to its?
I think it's like a broader conception.
It's an intellectual
modernity.
Yeah, intellectual argument about intellectual.
So the most charitable way I could read this is what he's pointing out as all these people come up with forces that undo the optimism of rationalism in early modernity, and it's a natural result of modernist thinking. But that is like me doing the work for him, like.
That happens often, though, you know.
That's the only
find something really interesting and very worth engaging with. But only if you spend like 5 minutes just deconstructing with other people.
I buy your argument about what he's saying here, but I'm not sure that I could have even come to that independently reading this myself.
That's a problem, I would say.
Yeah, it's a real problem.
Yeah, well, because the concepts of suspicion that he like links as if they're almost the same aren't like really. Right. Like they might play a functional role, like for the unconscious as a reason to just trust the individual versus the forces of production as a reason to trust society. But except in Marx, the forces of production are dialectically complicated. They're both good and bad. And I mean, like look, Marxists have trouble getting their heads around that too. Like, so fair. True. But because we just seem wildly like the way we talk about capitalism as if it's utterly bad, and then like, but it's better than other things sometimes.
Right. Well, and then we're meant to choose sides. You're either like anti-work, anti-production, or you're either like pro-productive forces and pro-generalization of the proletarian condition. When the whole point of it is like the dialectical overcoming of those two things.
Right.
I won't get on my soapbox.
what Hegel talks about, just tarrying with the contradiction, just tarry with it a while. That's
Tarry with
why.
it.
Because
Just have a tarry.
you can think several thoughts all at once, and they're all contradictory, and it's worth
They're all kind of
just accepting that
also
sometimes.
a little bit true. Like
Right.
there are ways in which capitalist modernity is better than the quote feudal unquote period that preceded it, and there are ways in which it isn't. And over time, I actually think the ways in which it isn't become more and more apparent. But that doesn't mean that the initial liberatory effect wasn't real, and that's a hard ask to keep all those seemingly really radically contradictory like sentiments in their head, and that's just from the Marxist point of view. And so you start layering these other modernity theories that kind of turn into heuristics of suspicion on top of each other. It gets really, it's a lot, but it's also overwhelming. And what I have to do to make that paragraph make sense is go to the most abstract way in which we're talking about a heuristic of suspicion, and then like ignore the specifics entirely. And then if I do that, I can take the charitable reading that Jason is taking, but I can't do it without doing that, which makes it a muddled paragraph no matter how you parse it. Like,
well, yeah, if you want the material to be accessible to everybody and understandable, then it's worth spending more time on that.
It's worth noting.
It's not the Bible, we don't have to parse out what they mean in Deuteronomy.
But it's
we
worth
know the author, he's
noting
alive right now.
It's worth noting in this book, as we're about halfway through it, which parts of it are very clear and just like surface on the face of it and understandable, and which parts start to get really muddled and confusing. I think that's a product of Dugin having a muddled and confusing philosophy, but also this sleight of hand that we've been talking about since the very, very beginning, this bringing people under like broad first principles that seem self-explanatory, that if you're on the left you could agree with it, if you're on the right you could agree with it, and then you get into the nuts and bolts of it, as we are in the middle here, the actual philosophical content, the political content of it, and it's necessarily becomes obscurantist because A, he's an irrationalist, and B, he's trying to pull the wool over people's eyes and create something like, I don't know, the American Communist Party out of this shit. And I guess it's kind of working in that sense,
which is both a chauvinistic stance about American culture, but also an anti-chauvinistic stance about American culture simultaneously. I mean, that is something that is different about the ACP than, say, the LaRouchites, where the LaRouchites have a clear conspiratorial singular worldview that's really based on a dude, and the ACP really doesn't. Like, it's multiple slightly incoherent philosophies incoherently smashed together, papered over by cheesy AI. Oh, God. I mean, it's aesthetic, but like,
and more and more open anti-Semitism and blood libel. The Jews killed Jesus. You can get that straight from the ACP.
Yeah.
Moving on.
Consequently, for those of you who don't know, that literally came out today that Jackson Hinkle's like, you can't trust anything they do. After all, they killed Jesus. And I'm like, oh, wow, we're there, huh?
We're doing it. We're doing it.
I would like to make a Christian apologist argument against the idea that you should blame anybody for conducting the will of God. That was the whole point.
That was the whole point. Without the crucifixion, what do you even have?
Yeah. It does seem, I'm not going to get into the weirdness of Christian blood libel claims, but it always has seemed to me like not particularly coherent to be like, the Jews did what God wanted them to do, and therefore we hate them.
Right.
The Jews did what God wanted them to do. Now, therefore, we're saved, and we hate them.
Right.
That's actually a really good reason. That's a perfect example of why you have to have both a cultural understanding of history, but also an economic one.
Right.
Because if you don't understand the motivations behind what people say, then you just seem to say things which are incomprehensible. I mean, good or bad, they only make sense if you also understand what else was happening that they weren't talking about.
Listen, clout chasing internet rackets Those are a great economic incentive, I tell you.
Well, yeah, maybe. I don't know.
We'll
I
see.
was
We'll
listening
see
to
how it pans
I
out.
was listening to Alex Jones talk about how many views he got on something on X, and then talking about how it didn't translate to any engagement or sales, and he didn't put it together that meant that like we got 1 million views, but we're not selling anything. And I'm like, doesn't that imply that your 1 million views are bots? Like,
Yeah,
Strongly implies that. Yeah.
it at least makes a solid argument.
Either 100% bots or mostly bots with a bunch of like poor teenagers thrown in the mix who can't even
I'll
afford
tell you,
InfoWar mugs,
as a
or
person who
supplements.
I've watched people on Twitter that when I left Twitter X like 7 months ago and came back, their following has gone from like 4,000 to like 10,000. And I'm going like, how in the fuck did that? But then I'm watching it myself and looking at my own numbers. Like I've already got back a half of what I used to have. It took me 10 years to get prior. But when I go through them, like every second person doesn't have a single post.
Right.
It's like okay. Anyway,
Mine hasn't gone up at all since the turnover, and I'm just guessing it's because I'm the most honest poster on the internet. I wouldn't accept the bots even if they had me.
Anyway, I think this is interesting here. Consequently, civilization has not merely removed savagery and barbarism, entirely overcoming them, but it itself is built precisely on savage and barbaric grounds, which transfer to the sphere of the unconscious. But there is not only nowhere to escape from this, on the contrary, they acquire unlimited power over man to the extent precisely because they are thought to be overcome and even non-existent. This is where the striking difference between historical practices of nations and societies, full warfare, oppression, cruelty, and the wild outburst of terror, abounding in the abrogating psychological disorders and pretensions of reason to harmonious, peaceful, and enlightened existence under the shadow of progress and development. In this respect, the modern era is not only an exception, but also the peak of the intensification of this discrepancy between the pretensions of reasons and the bloody reality of world wars, ethnic cleansing, and historically unprecedented mass genocides of entire races and Narodny. Way to do that, translator. Keep it Russian when you can just translate it as peoples. Anyway,
Crazy choice.
There is a little bit of disagreement about how to translate it, actually, because it does just mean peoples. But does it mean peoples in the way that we mean people, or does it mean people in the way that the German mean Volk, which means people? That distinction
means people in the way the German means Volk and our folk, and the Jew means goy.
Right.
So, which are the Korea means Waikugen. It means of a different culture, peoples of a different nation.
Yeah.
So
basically, I think I agree with the decision to keep it in Russian.
I don't know. I mean, like, I know what peoples means. No, peoples. If I'd said peoples versus people, I think I still would have got that. Like, if I say people, I agree with you. It's a mistranslation. Anyway, we could go back and forth about how you translate Narodny, because I don't speak Russian at all.
Nah, me neither. Not even close.
It's a you would say Narodi.
Yeah,
but it doesn't matter because hopefully you won't say it again anyways.
All right. In terms of savagery, modernity passes the most perfect technical means invented by civilization, right up to weapons of mass destruction. And thus, the critical tradition, structuralism, and the philosophy of postmodernity force. I mean, I think structuralism and philosophy of the postmodernity are actually diametrically opposed, as in the philosophy of postmodernity was post-structuralism. But anyway, force one to move from the mainly diachronic phase interpretation of civilization, which was the norm for the 19th century, and which by inertia continues to be widely in use, to be synchronic. So we're no longer talking about different stages, but civilizations are static things in time. Which that's a weird jump. Yeah. And that is using him using Saussurean categories from Saussurian. That's structural linguistics.
Yeah, so like Dugin will talk about things and be like, everything is dialectical except for the things which should never change. Some things are static
Right.
forever, and some things are in constant motion.
Yo, this dude
And
is
it
such a
makes-
fucking. He's such an undergrad. Dugin is such an undergrad, dude. He's like a philosophy 200 type guy. You know, he's gotten over like the basics, but now he's just like throwing everything he's got at the wall. This is very pretentious.
I somewhat agree. I would even, my thing about this is like we do have to recognize the fundamental irrationalism of the way he ad hocs different frameworks and throws them together without dealing with the fact that frameworks are not copacetic. They don't have similar epistemological, ontological, and material assumptions. And I think he's trying. You see, this is where like the charitable versus uncharitable reading becomes really important, but it also is hard for me to square this with other Dugin that I've read outside of this book. Because sometimes I'm like, no, you'll blatantly contradict what you say in this book and other books, and it feels like it's because it's written for a different audience. And like,
I also
does that
just
mean
think
I should go ahead?
he just contradicts himself, and he's just okay with it. Whereas,
Yeah, that too.
I think maybe you should just be a little bit more concerned with it. Whereas he just, I think if you asked him, like, you said these two different things, and he would give you a big answer that about why reality is these two different things. So I think he's trying to do something interesting. I just think it's not very clear.
This
I don't
just
know. He
reads
was
like
a before he converted to Orthodox Christianity. He was a chaos musician, and I think it shows.
Yeah.
I was gonna say this reads to me like undergrad crank shit, like the kind of shit we would like maybe smoke a little DMT in the dorm room or whatever, and fucking wow, the fucking cosmos, the universe. I don't know.
Yeah,
man.
when I was 25, I wrote
You're probably
for
right.
I wrote for a magazine called Green Triangle, and I tried to come up with a theory of civilization like this, and it was fucking stupid, and I have suppressed every last bit of it from the internet that anyone can ever find.
We have to get into the files. We got to find that file.
Coming soon. Fifth political
yeah,
theory by
the pre-Marxist political theory of Varn is a lot weirder than
Someday it's
people
gonna make
realize.
it. Someday when your Marxist Internet Archive page goes up, that's gonna be like the first, like in the prefatory notes towards Varnism.
Yeah, then like someone will be like against Western Varnism and cite my early pre-Marxist works as my Marxist works, and then like say it doesn't make any sense. Anyway,
Yeah, I was into Varn before he was a Marxist.
which if you were, okay.
What are you still doing here?
I'm really more of a Reformation Varn. I'm more like Calvinist Varn.
Yeah.
No, I'm not a Calvinist anything.
Because I had like a Buddhist theory of politics that also was like vaguely kind of fascistic. But anyway.
Well, look, from small beginnings, right?
All right. Savagery is that which explains civilization and is key to it. It turns out that man buried to proclaim civilization as that which has already actually happened, which it remains no more than an incomplete plan, constantly suffering disruption under the onslaught of cunning energies of the unconscious. However, we might understand it as the Nietzschean will to power are psychoanalytically. I mean, okay, sure. Like, civilization is based on a fundamental crime. Even Benjamin agrees with that, so fine. Yeah. The deconstruction of civilization. Okay, let's get into this. However, in practice, one can apply structuralist approaches for the deconstruction of the concept of civilization. Skip ahead. The main characteristic of civilization is often thought to be an inclusive university. That is, the theoretical openness of the civilizational code for those who would like to join it from without. Inclusive university is, at first glance, the complete antithesis of exclusive particularity, the primary characteristic of tribal and ancestral societies of pre-civilizational period. Asterisk. Bullshit! Unasterisk. Anyone who's ever studied anthropology knows that that is bullshit. Like, tribes will come up with weird fucking kinship justifications to be able to include people.
Yeah.
also, what the fuck do you think marriage is? Like, you're usually
this is a
banned
really
from
good
marrying
example of,
within your tribe. So
yeah,
go ahead.
this is a good example of like when you try to imagine the past, but you can only do so with contemporary lens. So we imagine like, like the Flintstones, caveman gets in his car and goes to work. He joins the lodge. He has marital, whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe it's interesting, but that's really bad for a historian to do. And this is why.
Right.
Agreed.
But the historical
And
proceedings.
it's always a very right wing. I'm sorry, but it's always a very it's always right wing coded whenever anybody does that, right? This attempt to take the present and then thrust it off into the past.
Well, yeah, although it is interesting how I think that is, I would actually challenge you a little bit because of David Graeber's whole fucking career is basically X thing from the anthropological past are from objectively less socially complex societies. And I'm not using complexity as a good thing here. I want people to like know that. It's just that is actually the exact same as X complicated thing from later on. So for Graeber, for example, he'll argue that the state is basically just kinship. Because it's an extrapolation of the same tendency, but because he has nary, and I don't have as much as our friend Jason here, but since he has nary a shred of Hegel in his bones, he can't see that like eventually quality becomes quantity and vice versa. So if you expand the size of the claim of the extension, it changes its nature eventually. So the state isn't reducible to kinship, really, even though it emerges from the same process. Yeah, go ahead.
At most, you could say you can see it expressions of what will eventually become the state in certain from a certain vantage point when it comes to kinship. You could say that there's embryonic ideas which conglomerated together in a much more complex way because of all sorts of other factors. You can see how the one tendency can become its own distinct reality, and that's the state. And that tendency might be present earlier, but they're not the same at all.
Right. But I will say that post-structuralists do tend to do what Dugin is doing here, which is to see that the structural components being similar means that they're the same thing, and thus we can, if like we're just undoing Marin additives, for example, or something like that.
Right.
Like which is the wrong way to think about it. And even though there's a real impulse there that it's not to, it is to be applauded. Like, yeah, that some of our civilizational wiggishness is utter bullshit, and it's a cover for other things that we're doing that is not pretty. But the inverting it as if, well, everybody just lies and they're all basically the same thing is a different, like, that's not the conclusion you should probably actually reach. But if you were just flipping the assumption on its head, that's what you would do. And I think this is like, I hate to give Matt McManus a whole lot of credit. I mean, he's a friend of mine, but like, I often disagree with his liberal socialism stuff. But I think he is right about even the left part of post-structuralism, even the parts of it that are maybe true. There is a way in which it is unconsciously right-wing coded because it does not see any way out of a perpetual universal status quo.
Yeah,
that is
that's the thing about this book in particular that I am very sympathetic to. All else aside, there is this impasse that as a result of liberalism being triumphant over its negation and whatever its other negation, and even the communists become liberals, but they're still communists, and the fascists become liberals, but they're still So I'm sympathetic to that and his attempt to construct a way out of it, but I'm not sympathetic to all kinds of stuff. But I am super sympathetic to this book, but I also would not want to promote it because I would only want to read it with people like you.
Yeah, this is one of those books
Safely.
that, like,
yeah, exactly.
Well, this is one of those books that if you take at face value, it's going to lead you, I think, into some very bad places. But it is the kind of challenge that we don't get enough anymore about what the stakes of liberalism are. And I do think it's interesting. I will give Dugin a little bit of being on the zeitgeist of where the right in the West was actually going to go. Because, 6 years later, you get Patrick Deneen and Ron Dreyer and Vermicule and those kind of guys. They're not Duginists, but they say similar things about liberalism and the
they're
way
grasping in a similar direction.
Right.
They're grasping in a similar direction, even though it's not exactly the same.
Right. There's something in the emergent field that is leading right wingers into this kind of direction. And also in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, in the stagnation and beginning unraveling of communism had also led left wingers there. That's the way I would explain this. And there is something about the weird tension between civilization, colonialism, and imperialism that does get worked out in very vulgar terms in a lot of the Marxist left, which this rhymes with, but it actually isn't the same thing if you go through it slowly. But I just don't know if he wants you to go through it slowly. There's a certain amount of I don't know if he wants you to really pull this threads out this detailedly. Maybe he does. It's hard for me to tell from the way he's writing, and I also can't tell from the translation either. So,
I was trying to compare them, but
maybe the point is you have to read Dugin in the original Russian.
Honestly, there's something to that. I'm very sympathetic to that, not just about Dugin, but about this basic argument that you can always get a sense of what is being proposed. It's worth translating pamphlets and books and so on. But sometimes you can even mostly can only get the full meaning in the original language, because every translation is going to be different, and some translations are going to be 70% good and 70 whatever. You have to read multiple translations of capital before you really understand. Yeah, and that's just you can pick examples like poetry or dramatic. Dramatic.
I would say even worse with Hegel, even more than with Marx. Because so many of the Hegelian, I call them puns. I don't mean that they're funny, but the Hegelian double play on words. In English, you have to pick whether you're translating them as spiritual or rational, and in the original German, they are clearly both. Zeitgeist, for example, both has a religious and a non-religious meaning in Hegel.
I was trying to compare the standard, the Miller translation of the phenomenology, and then the new one, the Fuss and Dobbins, which is actually, I think, eminently more readable. But until I know German, I won't know which one is more faithful to whatever. And I don't want to read both because it's not the most fun stuff to read.
Honestly, Jason, I don't even know that if you learn modern German, it would get you there, because I have read Hegel in German, and I hit things that I'm like, what? And I go back and I'm like, oh, I have to know this pun in Swabian dialect from 200 years ago. Fuck. And
that's why I think it's worth reading all kinds of stuff all the time. That's why I would read this, not because I'm like, oh, this is the missing piece of my ideology, but because some thoughts are going to permeate in the world anyways. I want to understand them.
Well, this is one thing where I'm sympathetic to some of these weird left-right hybrid people, where I will give them a little bit of credit. You do need to read right-winger sympathetically, and simply not engaging them does not actually get you out of the problem. In fact, it just makes you completely blind when they throw something at you that's going to sound like something you already believe in, and then you're just gonna be like, what?
I think I've said this before, but it's my favorite. The best thing that what's the guy's name? The Oregon guy.
Wilhelm Reich.
Yeah, really, the only I think very valuable observation from Wilhelm Reich is that when there would be a rally, and communist agitator would stand up and he would give a speech, which was very moving if you already agreed, because he would talk about the forces of production and the movement of history and development and so on. And then the Nazi speaker would get up and he would speak to all kinds of things, which to the communists seems absurd, but to a bunch of people, all different kinds of people for different reasons, felt their, this heartstring plucked or that heartstring plucked, or this vague concern, which is not quite so easily definable as the communist guy says, the Nazi was able to talk about these things that the communists were just like not schooled in it because they weren't debating, they weren't they weren't engaging with the mystical or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah,
that
even
turns out to have mattered a lot.
Even on something like workers' dignity, communists would be like, well, that's too abstract. We're not going to use that.
Yeah.
And part of me is sympathetic to that as an analytic. And you guys will hear me talk about this with justice a lot. That's my key term that I focus in on so much. But I actually realize that, like, yeah, if I don't have an answer for justice, I'm like, fuck, man, who's going to listen to me? But,
well,
like,
this is
at the same time...
Oh, sorry. I was just saying when Mao was talking about the mass line versus the party line, this is kind of why. I mean, I'm not a big Mao. I'm not a fan, whatever. But there's some interesting things in there like that. You have to be able to know how to, well, dare I say, talk to people in a language that they speak, while also holding in your own head what you would like to say.
I take up this a lot when I read Mao, and I'll read Mao, and I'm like, this sounds like fucking Taoist folk wisdom, or it sounds very dry and stupid. Like his stuff on practice, like, through practice. I'm like, well, what the fuck does that actually mean? Nothing. Yeah. But then I'm thinking about, like, okay, but he's talking to illiterate peasants. And I don't mean that to be like, oh, they're stupid. That's not my point. It's like, but he's trying to meet them at a vocabulary level. And and we're also reading it in English, which either can be both over exoticized in translation or under exoticized in translation simultaneously, with Chinese in particular. So it's like, it's hard to know. Even, like, I've often said, like you'll hear liberalism refer to some things in Mao where you're just like, what? Like, what? But what's the context in Chinese? Like, anyway, back to this. I mean, we're recognizing this groundlessness. Various decisions can also follow. Either we try to find a syncretic model of unification of both civilizations, at least in theory, into a general system, or admit the correctness of other civilization. Okay, we got a twist. So we're talking about civilization as a singular concept. Now we got civilizations as a multiple concept, are the correctness of other civilizations. But he's already been speaking as if the only conception of civilization prior is Western civilization. And so this is where I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure this is a bait and switch, but it does seem strategically very subtle in a way that makes my hackle go up. Because we haven't admitted that there are other valid concepts of civilization really at all in this reaccount of what it is. In other words, we are dealing with the transfer of previous tribal ethnic groups into a higher level of generalization. See also it is so fascinating to me how much I can compare David Graeber to Aleksandr Dugin.
Well,
just to piss both sides off, but like,
when I made my little quip earlier, and you said, "Well, David Graeber does that all the time with the past." I think maybe there's a plausible thesis that David Graeber was a conservative. Maybe you can make that. Maybe we can make that argument somehow. That's for
I
another
actually
show,
think
though.
he was incoherent. But anyway, inclusivity.
I think that Graeber was kind of like Dugin. He's like grasping at things and often quite blindly.
Yeah,
but I don't think it's worthless though.
No,
I don't think so either. Even if I spend a whole lot of my life deconstructing, the dawn of everything as being like vulgar as fuck and basically hyper voluntarism, actually in a similar way that this is. But
there is a rational kernel too.
Right.
But even if it's not very big.
The way that I read the sloppiness of the two, Graeber and Dugin, the way that now I've read obviously Graeber before, and now we're reading Dugin, the muddled content, throwing everything up against the wall. It's like an attempt to grasp hope out of darkness and despair. It's like, from a personalistic sort, like individual sort of way, I feel like both Graeber and Dugin are attempting to like excavate through philosophy or anthropology some sort of like negative critique or like positive characteristics of the past and the present that might give them hope to continue living, not jumping off a fucking bridge.
Yeah.
You know, it's very Christian in that way, right?
Yeah, it very much is.
All right, this is easy to recognize in the following striking examples. Greeks considered themselves a civilization, numbered everyone else among barbarians. The origin of the word barbarian is an onomatopoeic pejorative, signifying whose speech makes no sense and is a bundle of animal sounds. Many tribes have similar relationship to members of different tribes. Not understanding their language, they often think the others have no language at all. Consequently, they do not consider them people. From here, incidentally, it is derived from the Slavic tribal name Nepzi, Germans, that we call Nemi, dumb, silent, mute. Those who do not know what anyone is calling himself, a man should know the Russian language. Among the ancient Persians, who represented precisely a civilization with pretentious to universality in the form of their Mazdian religion, which is funny. These go in here. I'm like, dude, you're a Christian. Like, what do you want? This was expressed even more clearly. Division into the Iran, the people, and the Turan, the demons, was drawn on the level of religion, cults, rites, and ethics. I mean, there's an interesting, however, I want to talk about the Parsis for a bit, because there's an interesting tension in ancient Iranian culture between universalism, which is there, like they didn't require people to convert to their religion, and ultimate particularism, which is also there. You can't convert to Zoroastrianism in most forms of Zoroastrianism.
Right.
So it's like a weird hybrid state, kind of like Judaism, except Judaism you can convert, but it's hard.
Well, I mean, it depends on who you ask. Certain sects of Judaism won't recognize converts.
Which one won't accept any converts?
Well, I guess you might know more about this than I do, but I feel like if you're Orthodox, there's only one. I guess I had heard, and maybe I understand this incorrectly, that Orthodox Judaism you can't just convert into.
You can, but you can't do it without a 3-year process and being denied 3 times. Okay. Let me explain that a little bit more, though. There are heraldi who see converts as lesser, even in Orthodox Judaism, that is heresy. That's an actual heresy to
right.
When you're given a Jewish name, you're supposed to be like as if you were always Jewish. And that's also why you can't revert.
Right.
But yeah, but I will say in practice, there are a lot of ultra-Orthodox who do not accept converts. So
right, but that's different. That's important. Officially,
right,
yes.
Officially, there's a conversion. Right. And interestingly, before Christianity and Islam, Judaism was easier to convert to than after.
It's interesting. You're seeing, at least from what banter online I'm seeing, basically like 2 Judaisms, like a new Judaism arising in the diaspora community, which defines itself against Zionism, and then a Israeli Judaism, which encompasses like Haredi, Orthodox, and Reformed also, which is like stands opposed to the diaspora. I think that on top of all the other chaotic and violent things that's happened over the last year, I feel like we've seen a definitive split within Judaism between a sort of like deist, culturalist, diaspora Judaism on the one hand, and then the Zionist one on the other. And it's fascinating to watch that happen in real time.
Zionism was initially a totally secular philosophy.
I know, not anymore though.
No, it has changed. And Yasha Rabin makes an argument, and I'll give Yasha credit. I don't think he's anti-Semitic because he's Jewish. That there is a tension about the relationship to land in Judaism that you can't just throw away, because the land of the people is fundamental to the religion in all aspects, even in the ultra-Orthodox. However, my pushback on him is still as a diaspora, because all Judaism after the fall of the Second Temple is diaspora Judaism. Yeah. So it's like, it's a fundamental tension in the religion, and it's kind of like the particularity versus universalism in Christianity. Do I get mad if my Christian friends don't try to convert me? Should I, since they believe that if they don't, I'm going to hell? Like, how do you feel about that? Like,
well, there are some contradictions which only could be resolved by schism or by reformation, which means religious war.
Right. Which is why, by proxy to religious thought, I've always been like, hey guys, we can't all get along on the left for reasons that actually are substantive, not just about circular firing squads. Like some of us do have, there has to be eventually a line where you're like, you're no longer in. Like, and
I draw that line closer to myself every day, but you guys are in it.
Wait, and you can define lines in such a way as to put them very far away, but you have to be able to see them and when they get crossed.
Yeah.
Right.
You know? There have to be some boundaries, otherwise the party is all. We already have the party. We've already won.
If that Jackson Hinkle guy wasn't on the other side of the line 2 days ago, he sure as fuck is now.
Right. Well, I'll give you an example, like here, to think about this and the tensions that he's only parting out one side of. Almost all languages that we know of are ethnocentric, in that like the word for people and the word for belonging to the ethnicity are almost always the same in the early forms of the language. Yeah. However, there's a countervailing tendency, to use a Marxist tendency, about expanding kinship constantly that most ethnic groups have, because if you're totally ethnocentric, you will inbreed yourself into oblivion.
Right. It's actually an evolutionary adaptation. It has a cultural expression where you are constantly redefining your particularity in relation to someone else's, so as to embrace, what we call the universal.
Right.
Because otherwise you're going to be extinct.
Right. And the universal and a lot of less complex societies tends to be the constant expansion of family language.
It's the irony of the Habsburg pretensions in the 15th and 16th century towards universal empire, and yet they only particularly fucked each other and got the Habsburg chin.
Yeah. It's also it's in another way.
They bred themselves out.
The argument against well, that's the problem with A, socialism in one country, but also B, rejection of other countries. It's like we have both. You can't have particularity, but only for us.
Yeah, I mean, this is why the national question is I like to say it as a real and not just apparent contradiction in socialism. Because I think it's
very real.
If you go too much on the anti-national element of socialism, you end up being basically a chauvinist for your own culture as an administrative apparatus. If you go too much to the particularization of socialism, where you believe that like socialism in one country is possible, you are just wrong and kind of dumb, because there's no society on earth that can be closed without collapsing. And B, I mean, that's not just a socialism thing, frankly. And B, that is also hard for me to see how you're not, but we're a pluralist. You're not going to stay pluralist, right? You're like,
well, yeah. I think there's a reason why we, at least on this internet way, at least in the cultural, the language of the culture, we see an increasing number of what we might call red-brown formations on one side, and you see liberal socialism as a new watchword.
Right.
And it's not that they're all bad. It's definitely not that they're all good. It's just that they are both expressions of the way in which all of humanity seems to be at an impasse.
It's an unsublated contradiction to which interesting. I get this from people who almost became post-Marxist, the value critique people, not the value form critique people, not the value theory people. It's called work critique in German, Werkkritik, around like Robert Kerr and people like Kurz and people like that. is that they were like, no, we need a new social ontology to express this, but we also, as good materialists, cannot have that social ontology prematurely. There's no way to articulate it until it comes into being. So we're stuck grasping in the way that Dugin's actually, I think, accurately expressing between the old and the new, unable to articulate either very well.
Similar to Dugin, actually.
Right. Yeah, I mean,
that's what he always talks about. Like the fourth
this whole book
is going to have to do this. It's like,
his whole theory is anticipatory, right?
Yeah, this is a book about how eventually there will be a new theory, whatever.
Right. It has to be, he says.
Right. Whereas I would say I'm an anticipatory Marxist, and then I think Marxism is an unfinished and also stalled, profoundly stalled thought process, by which, if we start to complete it, we will no longer need to reference the fucking text as if they are going to answer all of our questions. Because they don't. I mean, like, you know, I love getting
part of the problem. Yeah, that's why we're part of why we are where we are.
And that also is a particular condition for people like Dugin and for people like us, and which is why the weirdo right often mirrors the far left, in so much that we are trying to come up with something that is really outside of contemporary frameworks, and whereas the standard conservative or liberal does not have to articulate that because their framework already exists. And like and for us it's harder because I don't think it's fair to say, oh, communism has never been tried in the simple way that, say, Trotsky is used to, or people will say today. But we also can't say that there's any society that saw itself as successfully building communism, because even by their own standards, most of these societies did not claim that. Right. So it's a very weird place to be. All right. All right, the synchronic and plural understanding of civilizations that prevails today. This is where I think the pernicious stuff really is. I'm skipping the Rousseau bits because it's not that relevant. Okay. With the preliminary observation, we can turn to what include today in the concept of civilization when we develop Huntington's
Samuel Huntington
again thesis about the clash of civilization, or raise objections to it with the ex-president of Iran, Khatami, insisting upon the dialogue of civilizations. That was the reformist back in the early aughts. You remember Khatami?
I remember the name. I don't remember.
He won a détente with the West, but he got sidelined by the axis of evil thing by George Bush after 9/11. And then that led to Ahmadinejad coming to power.
Yeah, which led to the riots and uprising around the election of 2008. I'm guessing those were Khatamiist, reformist youth in the streets.
Right,
I remember that.
Yeah, they were. Yeah. The very fact that there is hardly any consensus on the use of the term civilization evidently shows that the phase, purely historical, progressive interpretation of the concept prevailing in the modern epoch. I mean, I would love him to more clearly denotate what the modern epoch is, but nonetheless, I get what he's talking about. Generally accepted in the 19th and first half of the 20th century, has clearly lost its relevance today. Only the most outdated researchers stuck in the uncritical modernity Count Bentham can contrast civilization with barbarity today. Although it is comfortable to use the term civilization instrumentally in a historical analysis in the description of ancient types of societies, still it has nearly lost all of its ideological charge as a global positive in comparison with the global negative, barbarism or savagery. I mean, you know, socialism or barbarism actually is based on this kind of faux dichotomy. That's why I kind of think Bordiga had a point about Avanti Barbari. Like, it's just like, we're not totally against the barbarians, people. Universalism, gradualness of development, and the anthropological unity of human history on the philosophical level all have been put in the question. I'm not sure that we actually have put in the question the anthropological unity of human history. David Graeber has, but he doesn't believe in biology. I know that's going to be controversial to Graeberites, but he doesn't. Sorry. By his studies in structural anthropology based on the rich ethnographic and mythological material of the life of the North and South African tribes, Levi-Strauss convincingly shows the conceptual and mythological systems of the same primitive societies by their complexity, richness of nuance, and connections and functional elaborations of differentiation are in no way inferior to those of more civilized societies. Yeah, but he's doing that in like the 1930s. Also, like, is that the only anthropology you've ever read? Is Levi-Strauss?
Sounds
For
like
real?
it. Yeah.
Like, anyway, I mean, we might as well be talking about Fraser or something. In political discourse, there is still talk of the privileges of civilization, but even this already looks anachronistic. We are confronted with a spike of uncritical ignorance when liberal reformers tried to present the history of Russia as a continuous chain of unchecked barbarity in the face of flourishing, resplendent, and established Western civilization. Yeah, okay, so you're pissed off at how shitty some post-Soviets were.Got it. Sometimes I think he does show his hand, and I'm like, some of this is more personal than he's letting on. However,
the civilization versus barbarism dichotomy still very much exists in Israel-Palestine discourse, or Arab versus
very much
versus
so.
Judeo-Christian discourse, right? Like, if there's anyone that's still barbarized ideologically in our day and age, and violently, it is, of course, the Arab people, especially of the Levant.
Yeah.
See, it was the Levant Arabs versus
well, like Gulf Arabs, those are civilized. They're liberal. They understand us, even if they do things, in a way which is
even if they're even more theocratic.
Even if they use slavery, that doesn't kick them out of civilization.
Because at least they will develop wealth, and with wealth, eventually they will also they'll just change. They'll develop. That's just what wealth does. Eventually, it makes you better. Except unless you're Levant Arab. And
well, I mean, civilization in this day and age means bourgeois, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, totally.
So the Qataris are civilized because they're bourgeois, but of course, because you don't have independent national capitalist development in the West Bank, you have barbarism. Although it gets sticky because Osama bin Laden is the product of civilization, but then goes to barbarism. So it's not even the best. Doesn't get much more bourgeois than Osama bin Laden.
That's true.
Yeah, it's interesting, actually.
But that's why maybe this isn't the terms that we want to be using. Dugin can use it if you. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's actually funny that, like, and this was overhyped a few months ago, but like these anti-imperial, like, bourgeois liberal Gen Z kids, like, being like, oh, I believe that Osama bin Laden was right. And I'm like, that's just, like, because you're accepting a bourgeois framework and you're also not reading it all correctly.
Yeah. It was a political intervention. The man was intervening in an election.
Right.
Right. The text that everyone was reading was his justification around the 2004 Kerry versus George W. Bush. I remember it. I remember like it was yesterday. That's the context.
Yeah. With the exception of the propagandistic symbols, are hopeless backwardness of uncritical philosophers and the framework of even distant familiarity with contemporary philosophy. I was he's talking about, like, Bernard Henri Levy. I don't know. The concept of civilization in the discourse does not contradict the mainstream, is interpreted without any moral charge whatsoever, but used in a technical term, and also implies something not opposed to barbarism and savagery, but to another civilization. And Huntington's famous.
I want to point out to the listener. I want to point out that was all one sentence.
Yes. Yeah, with multiple buts.
Yeah.
In Huntington's famous and aforementioned article, there is not a word about barbarism. He speaks exclusively of borders, structures, particularities, frictions, and differences of various civilizations which are opposed to each other. And this feature is one of not only those of his positions or lines of argument stemming from Toynbee, whom Huntington clearly follows. The use of the term in contemporary context already suggests blatant pluralism, comparatism, and, if you like, synchronism. So that, like, there's a frozenness to these civilizations, they don't change. Here, philosophical criticism and the reconsideration of modernity, implemented in 1,000 different ways in the course of the whole 20th century, are immediately impactful. And so, if we dismiss the recurrences of uncritical liberalism and the narrow-minded naivete of the pro-American and pro-Western propaganda, we can see today the term civilization, an operational and active political analysis, is used above all synchronically and functionally in order to designate a right and stable geographical and cultural zones, united by approximately a common spiritual, moral, and stylistic and psychological agreements and historical experience. Now, pair that back with what he said a while back about civilization and empire being the same. He is not at all an anti-imperialist.
Yeah.
He's an anti-colonialist.
Yeah.
I
think far too few of us on the left, anyways, bother to make the distinction and to recognize the distinction, and that happens. It tends to lead us astray often.
Oh, I think so.
And more than just here, honestly, there's a lot of weird stuff that we accept under decolonialization that I'm like, that's not compatible with our worldview.
Yeah, I've got my own theories on decolonization stuff, but I'm gonna let that go. Varn, you and I have talked about that shit.
Yeah, you and I have both talked about it a bit, and I'm also not gonna go on the people who are like, well, we should be pro-colonization because it allows us to spread, to eventually take over capital and flip the switch in the entire world. And I'm like, I don't know, man. I'm not sure about that.
All I know is whenever you have moments like the last 10, 15 years or, last 500 years when there's massive movements of people back and forth across land masses and oceans, that's when things get really interesting. We're in a very interesting time right now.
Yeah. Well, I do think the concept of indigeneity as tied to static uses of land is going to get real fucking problematic when there's not
real
anymore.
Yeah, real fast. We're all dealing with the consequences of that right now. We're dealing with the consequences of the nation state.
Right. And I think in the left, we literally have an inability to like parse what that would actually mean, particularly when some of these cultures that we're talking about with decolonization do not accept the nation state framework as a valid framework in the first place. So it's
and a lot of what people see as broadly imperialism, and especially American imperialism, is an attempt not to simply maintain certain states within the nation state system, but to defend a crumbling nation state system against its delegitimization, but also non-state actors who are claiming rights, claiming various political interests, despite not having a state, which threatens the entire order of the nation state, which is something that the American empire and specifically is his entire raison d'etre, is to have a nation state system, a system of sovereignties, and a system that allows that to continue. And it just gets harder and harder by the day, especially with the movements of peoples.
That would be one of the many distinctions between imperialism in the capitalist era and the concept of colonialism, and also the difference between a civilizational state in Dugin's conception versus a Western national states, which are either colonialists or imperialists or whatever. It's a different framework, and I think, usually we just equate them all as the same thing.
But they're not. They're not at all. Right. And so, like I don't think Dugin. In fact, I know in other writings, Dugin's not opposed to empire. I just know that, actually. He's opposed to a specific empire, but he's not opposed to the concept of empire, but he is opposed to the concept of colonialization. So, like, his framework is imperial but pluralistic.
Well, and also his internal to that framework, he is opposed to one kind of empire, but not the other. He does. He seems to very much dislike. Yeah. He dislikes empire as is talked about by people like Lenin.
Right.
Those kinds of empires he doesn't like at all. But if our borders touch and we have similar words, that's the basis of an empire, which very much accepts. And he's very
and if I have to conquer you to get you to realize that, so be it.
Well, yeah. That's why it's empire, and it's not just whatever fraternal relations or whatever.
Right.
But he is an anti-imperialist to a certain degree because he opposes the kind of empire that you live in and that I live in.
Right.
but he's not like
But
objectively anti-imperialist. He's only
no,
opposed to this kind of empire.
Lenin would have shot him.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
I think that's probably right.
just because like Lenin was opposed, like when Lenin's anti-imperialism was not the revolutionary defeatism where people are like, oh, we have to let one empire win because the other. It was very much like you don't pick sides against empires at all. Like,
well, yeah,
even
that's the critical thing about revolutionary defeatism, which is missing in the cosplay of today, is that the assumption is that instead of helping this empire, we're going to take over, we're going to win power. So it's okay if this empire loses because then we will be in power, and then that empire will lose by virtue of those people also becoming in power. But if you don't have a
and then we can join up.
Yeah, if you don't think of, and if you can't reasonably assume that you have, some kind of mass support and you have some, your finger on the pulse of the contradictions in the world, then we are reduced to cheering for one or another empire. So,
which is very de rigueur these days.
Yeah. The left is not Marxist enough to be Leninist yet.
Right. If antiquity civilizations most coincided with empires and were one way or another politically united, then today borders correspond to invisible lines, inevitably superimposed into administrative borders of governments. Some of these governments were never part of a single empire. For example, Islam spread everywhere in contrast to the Arabs who built the world caliphate. Others did not share common statehood, but were united amongst themselves in different ways, religiously, culturally, or racially.
So like the Germans. The Germans in the Holy Roman Empire.
Right. Yeah, the Germans were a cultural bloc. Although, if we're honest, they kind of weren't. Like, the Prussians and the, like, Bohemians, and, like, I mean, Bohemians were Czech, but, like, there's a lot of German speakers there, and,
like,
et cetera.
the Germans in Switzerland. And the
Germans
I mean, the differences even between northern and southern Germany.
Platzdeutsch versus like Bavarians. Yeah.
Right. The construction of a German state required Bismarck. It required
Prussia.
Some serious force. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was true for Italy too. I mean, honestly, it's true for England and for France as well. It's just that's further back in history where it's not obvious.
And it's not coinciding. It's not coinciding with.
Different, but they're
not that different though. Like genocidal politics is not unique to modernity, and that's something I wish that.
Dugin no, I don't mean that they're
hide behind.
Go ahead. I don't mean they're different in terms of the consequence. I mean they're just different in terms of their employment.
Oh yeah.
Because yeah.
Do you guys want to do this next session and then we'll log off? Is that good?
Yeah, let's do this. This will be our last section. I was gonna say like we should probably just do this. I'm trying not to hit people with 4 hours of digressions for 5 pages lately. The classical mode of historical analysis: classical, economic, liberal, racial. We have established that the use of term civilization in the 20th century and in the framework of criticism of modernity. I just want to add, this should have been the first chapter of this goddamn book if we wanted to be clear.
Yeah.
Like that's a big if.
Because this is the first time where I'm like, I finally know what you're talking about. There occurred a qualitative shift in the side of synchronicity and plurality. I will say this: when people like Dugin wants to radically change things, I'm like, he wants to radically change things so we can stay the same forever. Like. He really, it's not just that he's rejecting progress in abstract. He's rejecting the idea that civilizations change, which is necessarily mythic. Like, and he knows that. Like, but one can take a step further and attempt to understand why, in fact, the word usage has become so topical in precisely our time. Has it? I mean, it was because Huntington used it with neoconservatives. But it kind of wasn't topical between 2010 and until like a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Indeed, the earlier concept of civilization was not the subject of deliberate problematization. While it was customary for humanitarian academic circles to talk in terms of such a category, other approaches, economic, national, racial, class-based, dominated the political and closely related to it political science discourse. Today, we seem to think only in terms of economics, to speak of national governments and national interest, and more so, to put class analysis or racial approach at the head of one's analysis is less and less acceptable. Huh? In America?
Right.
The amount of
in America,
time, the amount of
think that
time
was
and
right.
energy Americans spend thinking about income and racial disparity. Oh my God, we're obsessed with it, and for obvious reasons.
I mean, I think in the 90s and the 2000s, basically in the pre-crash world, in the pre-Obama world, I think what he's saying is
more. I do think
it's understandable. Yeah.
From 92 to 2008, with the exception of the big rupture in the middle of that called 9/11, that somehow we've just the amount of stuff we pretended hasn't really happened as a culture and no longer has a big impact. It's kind of like crazy to me.
Yeah.
But like people will talk about, well, we forgot about the Floyd uprising and no one wants to talk about it. I'm like, we forgot about 9/11.
Yeah.
We forgot about the Iraq War. I mean, like,
it seems silly to talk about the discourse, but
right.
The average liberal and the average Republican culture in terms of political discourse in like 1999,
about a month,
and 2005, those are fairly similar. Whereas from 2005 2015, they transformed dramatically. Yeah, dramatically so.
The fact that we're even talking about Dugin is not just a Russian phenomenon actually tells you how much has changed.
Yeah.
To be quite frank. But I feel like even in 2012, this next statement wasn't true. Class-based analysis in the mainstream became irrelevant after the fall of socialism and the breakup of the USSR. That might have been true in 2008, but by the time this book was published in English, it was not true anymore.
Yeah, definitely.
It was true when he wrote it in Russian, but
I think you might even be forgiven for not catching wind of how much it's different.
Mm-hmm.
But by like 2 years after this edition was published, there should be an updated preface that says these are the things which have dramatically shifted since I published this book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Meanwhile, the impression grew that the national borders of homogenous, essentially liberal governments, no longer confronting any kind of systemic alternatives laying claim to a planetary scope after the fall of Marxism, would be abolished in the world leadership, and one world government would be established with a homogenous market economy, a parliamentary democracy, a liberal system of values on common infrastructure and information technology. I actually will point out that there is, when people wonder, like, oh, is he just playing populist when he goes on Alex Jones? He's a way smarter version of what Alex Jones is. But this sentence is Alex Jones' world. It really is.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is Alex Jones isn't as smart as Dugin, not the other way around. Not that Dugin's as dumb as Alex Jones. But that they actually do believe similar things. Like this idea that we were going to have one world government, like
black UN helicopters and FEMA camps, and I remember. Some of us still remember.
Yeah. In 1990, Francis Fukuyama emerged as a herald. I feel like he's like that. This book is totemic for him more than actual, because he just doesn't seem to get that the end of history and the last man was not all positive. The Fukuyama didn't think it was all good.
Right.
And that, honestly, Fukuyama hasn't been proved wrong yet.
Mm-hmm.
It's
pretty easy to confuse Fukuyama with Margaret Thatcher.
Right. But Fukuyama's point that, like, liberalism wins because its basic component of individualism is roughly attractive to everyone, even if it's a shitty future, and that it causes people to lose motivation. I don't necessarily see that much contradicting that right now.
Right.
Me too.
I do see like history seems to be coming back, but like in fits and starts, and it hasn't really yet. So, Fukuyama brought the development of the phase interpretation of the concept of civilization to a logical conclusion. The end of history, in his version, signified the final defeat of civilization over barbarism on all its forms, guises, and variants. No, it didn't. Go back and read that book. Like, that's not what he's actually saying. And I also I think it's interesting here. Where does Fukuyama get that from? He gets it from the same place a lot of the weird-ass French Hegelians get it from, which is Kojeva's interpretation of Hegel. It's the instat, the end state. That's Kojeva. Kojeva attributes it to Hegel. I've never found instat in Hegel. Like,
what's funny about that is that that's also, at least from my experience, at least from my vantage point, what I've seen is that's the pop version of Kojeva's interpretation of right Hegelianism is taken, well, at least it was once taken to be that's basically Hegel,
right? Yeah,
by the left. And it's like
it was.
You're so downstream it's so downstream of what you're talking about that's you can't really understand what you're talking about anymore.
Right. Well, because honestly, as much as we like to complain about the Frankfurt School, they would never say anything that stupid. That's because the predominant interpretation of Hegel came from France, and it was from the French Lacanians who got it from Kojeva's lecture specifically. Like, there's a specific date where they were all there. Like Sartre got it, and Lacan got it, and all of them got it from the same fucking lecture. Anyway, Huntington argued with Fukuyama, advancing as his mainstream argument the fact that the end of opposition of the clearly defined ideologies of modernity, Marxism, and liberalism in no way signified the automatic integration of humanity into a unified liberal utopia, in so much as under the formal construction. So this is what I find interesting is, even though this is against the Islamicist, this is Dugin picking sides in a debate between different kinds of neoconservatives. Because they're both neoconservative. I mean, and the way Fukuyama is less of a neoconservative than Huntington.
Right. So what sucks about what's so imprecise about Dugin's analysis is that it's very clear he's talking about the late 90s, well, all the 90s and early 2000s in Russia, and then also looking around the world for like who speaks to this set of conditions that like you need to know about Fukuyama if it's like in the early 2000s and you're writing philosophy. But he's writing about, well, like you said, he's writing about a conflict between different kinds of neoconservatives. In our context, that's true. In Russia, I think that's just what there was.
Yeah. You can imagine the terrain being evacuated of a lot else, right?
Yeah. Is no longer signified the automatic integration into a unified liberal utopia, in so much as under the formal construction of national governments and ideological camps were found deep tectonic plates, as it were, continents of collective unconscious, which as soon as they become clear were by no means overcome by modernization, colonization, ideologization, enlightenment, and as before predetermined to the most important aspects of life, including politics, economics, and geopolitics, in one or another segment of human society according to their belonging to a civilization. In other words, Huntington proposed to introduce the concept of civilization as a fundamental ideological concept. I'm just going to point out that Huntington's civilizations are pulled out of his ass. Like, seriously, they're not coherent. It's like the Islamic civilization, the Buddhist Confucian civilization, and I'm like, sure, man. Anyway, civilization is a fundamental ideological concept, and for the replacement not only of a class-based analysis, but also of liberal utopia, which took too earnestly and uncritically the propagandic demagoguery of the Cold War, and thus in turn became its victim. Capitalism, market liberalism, democracy seem universal and common commonly human only externally. Each civilization reinterprets its substance in accordance with its unconscious templates, where religion, culture, language, and psychology play a massive and often decisive role. I mean, I do think there's a way in which Marxists will miss that, like, the bourgeois Confucian and the bourgeois Christian don't actually think about the world in the same way, even though they have similar incentives and will do the same things. And I do think that, there's a problem.
I think it's because a lot of people, they think that to be Marxist means to only think about hard, economic categories, as if there's no such, as if culture is always downstream of it, and they're much more interrelated. You can be a capitalist, you can have class interests with a South Korean and someone in London, but you still have cultural differences, and sometimes you're going to make decisions based on those and not the others.
Right. Well, I mean, this is the thing that even in Marx and Engels, the base superstructure isn't unideterminative, except in the last instance, and people miss that. But like for example, the superstructure sets up the law, which changes relations of production, but that's in the base. The relations of production are in the base. So law does have an effect on the forces of production by changing the relations of production. There's been a Marxist movement going back to Soviet Marxism, but also in G.A. Cohen and the analytic Marxists, to separate that tension so that you can explain one unicausally. But that is a misinterpretation of Marx.
Yeah, that's why I think like Kautsky is more famous, Labriola is more interesting, and so on. Like people like Lunacharsky, or most famously people like Lukács, and they're kind of the outliers, and they're the weird philosophy weirdos, but they should have they represent a closer approximation to what I think. They're more correct.
Yeah, I have issues with Lukács, but I've become a lot more sympathetic to what he was on about. The more I deal with the relations of production, its relationship to the superstructure versus either the Vulgar structuralist, the mid-Soviet Marxists who were just about forces of production as if they didn't have a social relation context, and the analytic Marxists who basically get away with any kind of dialectics. So they just want to see, like, they basically are technological Whiggish utopians. And so all these things are quite problematic to me. What I find interesting here, though, is I think the unfolding of events in 1990 shows that Huntington proved in this argument to be closer to the truth. Really? I mean, because of what exactly? And Fukuyama himself obliged to, in part, reconsider his views, having admitted that he apparently spoke too soon. But the very revision by Fukuyama of the thesis of the end of history demands a thorough reconsideration. Yeah, it does. Also, he didn't say that all of it was over. That just I think a lot of these people, the people invoke Fukuyama without citing him in a way, or they cite a newspaper headline that was from 2006 without talking about what he said in his books. If you read the Fukuyama's Origins of Political Order and Origins of Political Decay, you will know that he is not the way he's being portrayed here at all.
Yeah. Right.
He has a much more thorough view of what's going on.
Well, again, we don't have any footnotes. We don't have any citations in this book. We have
assertions,
a polemic based on assertions. So
yeah,
well, I mean, we can't call out Dugin for that. We've all read Jay Sakai.
True. Some of us more than others, but all of us a bit.
Some of us a lot more than others.
Yeah. Our Domenico Lacerda.
Yeah. Oh, I haven't delved into that yet. That might be our next one. I don't know.
I'm not sure. Well, he does make citations, but his citations are often decontextualized and ahistoricized. So, but whatever. I mean, this part of the reason why this has so much appeal to leftists is because leftists have degenerated.
Mm-hmm.
I'm actually going to just say that outright. We have to blame ourselves for this having any appeal to leftists, because it does speak to some problems that we just don't address.
And we don't have ourselves a thoroughgoing critique of liberalism. right? So we have to kind of glom onto to another.
And the best we got so far seems to be, let's resurrect Soviet Marxism as if the rest of the 20th century didn't happen, and then also glom onto that random ad hoc shit that has nothing to do with it, but makes us feel better about ourselves. Let's resurrect Trotskyism as if that didn't utterly fail in every instance. Let's resurrect communization theory, which I don't even know. Well, I guess we riot ourselves to utopia when the ecological crisis makes us all get along. And I mean, like, look, having dealt with the cul-de-sacs of left thought, which we've all done because we've done this for 20 years or more. Like,
Yep.
I am not quite at year 20, but I'm close, and you two are. And I have been very much been like, when I read this book in 2012. I was not as hostile to it as I am right now because I was super fucking frustrated.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, I'm super frustrated still, and I'm also more sympathetic to this than you are.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
not quite as much as some people are.
Yeah.
Well, I tell you what I am is I'm ready to quit for the day. I've had a long day. So
yeah. Let us in here and
we'll do it again real soon.
In a month to finish this chapter. So I knew we weren't going to get through this chapter because it's actually, this is a chapter where I've like been reading like every other sentence because like it actually is rich and dense and not crazy like some of the other
It's good.
stuff.
We made it into the real meat and potato shit. So we'll continue on that in a month.
And it's not just because some of the paragraphs are sentences by themselves.
And there's 4 different translations, and each of us is reading a different one along with Vaughn. So long, everybody.
Yeah, so long.